Keir Starmer. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I welcome the Prime Minister back to his place and say that it's good to see him back in Parliament? I'm sure I speak for all of us when I say that. And although I've done this privately, can I congratulate him publicly with Carrie on the birth of their son? Mr. Speaker, when the Prime Minister returned to work a week ago Monday, he said that many people were looking at the apparent success of the government's approach. But yesterday we learned, tragically, that at least 29,427 people in the UK have now lost their lives to this dreadful virus. That's now the highest number in Europe. It's the second highest in the world. That's not success, or apparent success. So can the Prime Minister tell us, how on earth did it come to this?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, first of all, of course, every death is a tragedy, and he's right to draw attention to the appalling statistics, not just in this country, but of course around the world. And I think I would echo really in answer to his question what we've heard from Professor David Spiegelhalter and others, that at this stage, I don't think that international comparisons and the data is yet there to draw the conclusions that we want. What I can tell him is that at every stage as we took the decisions that we did, we were governed by one overriding principle and aim, and that was to save lives and to protect our NHS. And I believe that, of course, there will be a time to look at what decisions we took and whether we could have taken different decisions. But I have absolutely no doubt that what the people of this country want us to do now is, as I said just now, to suppress this disease, to keep suppressing this disease, and to begin the work of getting our country's economy back on its feet. And I look forward to working with him and colleagues around the House to do just that.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the argument that international comparisons can't really be made when the government's been using slides like this for weeks to do international comparison just really doesn't hold water. I'm afraid that many people are concluding that the answer to my question is that the UK was slow into lockdown, slow on testing, slow on tracing, and slow on the supply of protective equipment. And I want to go to yesterday's figures that show that whilst happily in hospitals it looks as though deaths are falling, deaths in care homes continue to go up. At the press conference last night, the Deputy Chief Scientific Advisor said, and I quote, "What this shows us is that there's a real issue that we need to get to grips with in relation to what's happening in care homes." I couldn't agree more. But 12 weeks after the Health Secretary declared that we're in a health crisis, I have to ask the Prime Minister, why hasn't the government got to grips with this already?
Well, actually, Mr. Speaker, I mean, he's quite right, of course, to look at the crisis in care homes, and he's absolutely right to say that there's an epidemic going on in care homes, which is something I bitterly regret, and we've been working very hard for weeks to get it down, and a huge amount of effort has been gone into by literally tens of thousands of people to get the right PPE to care homes, to encourage workers in care homes to understand what is needed. And I can tell him actually that he's not right in what he just said about the state of the epidemic in care homes. As he looks at the figures, in the last few days there has been a palpable improvement. We must hope that continues, and we will ensure that it does continue.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful for that. I was using the slide the government put up at its press conference last night, which shows, sadly, that, and I accept there's a lag to the 24th of April because of the reporting position, but that sadly deaths in care homes have been rising every time they've been reported by the ONS. And I have heard before from the First Secretary that numbers were falling. He said that a week ago Sunday. That's not borne out by these slides. We will wait to see what the next slides bring. Mr. Speaker, on the 30th of April, the government claimed success in meeting its 100,000 tests a day target. Since then, as the Prime Minister knows, the number has fallen back. on Monday there were just 84,000 tests, and that meant 24,000 available tests were not used. What does the Prime Minister think was so special about the 30th of April that meant that testing that day was so high?
Prime Minister.
Well, actually, I think that the Right Honourable Gentleman was right last week when he paid tribute to the amazing work of the NHS, the logistics team, everybody involved in getting up from 2,000 tests a day in March to 120,000 by the end of April. And yes, he's right that capacity currently exceeds demand. We're working on that. We're running at about 100,000 a day. But the ambition clearly is to get up to 200,000 a day by the end of this month, and then to go even higher. And as he knows and the whole House will know, testing, a fantastic testing regime is going to be absolutely critical to our long-term economic recovery.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I did pay tribute last week, and I'm glad the Prime Minister has now said that the target now is 200,000 tests a day by the end of this month. But of course, just having a target isn't a strategy. What is needed is testing, tracing and isolation. That's the strategy. Contact tracing was happening in the UK, but it was abandoned in mid-March. We were told at the time that this was because it was, quote, not an appropriate mechanism. But yesterday, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer said it was to do with testing capacity. So can the Prime Minister just clarify the position for us? Why was contact tracing abandoned in mid-March and not restarted sooner?
Prime Minister.
As I think is readily apparent, Mr. Speaker, to everybody who's studied the situation, and I think as the scientists would confirm, the difficulty in mid-March was that the tracing capacity that we had and that had been useful, as he rightly says, in the containment phase of the epidemic, that capacity was no longer useful or relevant since the transmission from individuals within the UK meant that it exceeded our capacity then. Now, the value of the test tracking and tracing operation that we're setting up now is that as we come out of the epidemic and as we get the new cases down, we will have a team that will genuinely be able to track and trace hundreds of thousands of people across the country and thereby to drive down the epidemic. And so, I mean, to put it in a nutshell, it's easier to do now that we've built up the team on the way out than it was as the epidemic took off. And I think most people with common sense can see those particular difficulties that we had at the time.
Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the Prime Minister's confirmed it was a capacity problem. Can I wish the government well on the tracking and tracing now and on the app that's being trialled in the Isle of Wight? We all want that to succeed, and we'll all support that in hopefully succeeding. Can I turn to protective equipment, where clearly there are ongoing problems? Just this week, the BMA survey said that 48% of doctors had to buy their protective equipment for themselves or rely on donations. That's clearly unacceptable. And it's obvious that this problem is going to get even more acute if and when the government asks people to return to work. We're clearly going to need a very robust national plan for protective equipment. Can the Prime Minister reassure the public that they won't be asked to return to work until that plan is in place?
Prime Minister.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I certainly can. And I share his frustration about PP and the frustration that I think people have felt across the House and across the country. It's been enraging to see the difficulties that we've had in supplying PPE to those who need it. But I do pay tribute again to the work of hundreds of thousands of people involved in the logistics of supplying literally billions of items across the country in a timely way. There have been no national stockouts of any PPE item, and we are now engaged in a massive plan to ramp up domestic supply, and he'll be familiar with what Lord Dighton is now at work. So that, to get to his final question, we are able, in the long term, and it may be the long term, to satisfy the domestic needs of this country.
Keir Starmer.
And we will, of course, be setting out the details about that plan on Sunday.
Keir Starmer again.
Mr. Speaker, I was going to come to the plan. I'm grateful to the Prime Minister for that indication. There are millions of people on furlough, as the Prime Minister knows, millions with children at home struggling with caring responsibilities. If they're to return to work, and if their children are to return to school, they need reassurance. I think we can all feel that, reassurance that it'll be safe to do so. And that means they do need to know what the government's plan is for the next stage. So will the Prime Minister give them that reassurance by setting out his plan as he says he will? Or will he come to this House on Monday to present that plan and have questions across the House?
Mr. Speaker, I will of course undertake that there will be a statement to the House, as you, Mr. Speaker, and the House would properly expect about what we propose tonight. So I just want to explain to the House as a courtesy why it's happening on Sunday, Mr. Speaker. I'm sure you'd be interested to know that. The reason for that is very simple, that we have to be sure that the data is going to support our ability to do this. But that data is coming in continuously over the next few days. We'll want, if we possibly can, to get going with some of these measures on Monday. I think it would be a good thing, Mr. Speaker, if people had an idea of what's coming the following day. That's why I think Sunday, the weekend, is the best time to do it. But of course, the House will be fully informed, and the House will have the full opportunity to debate and interrogate me or the government on that matter.
And hopefully in the future it will be to the House question.
We will make America great again.